1838 and 1839, as part of Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy, the Cherokee Nation was forced to give up its land east of the Mississippi River and to migrate to an area in present-day Oklahoma. The Cherokee people called this journey the Trail of Tears because of its devastating effects. The migrants faced hunger, disease, and exhaustion on the forced march. Over 20,000 Cherokees were forced to march westward along the Trail of Tears. About a quarter of them died along the way, but it was the Native Americans who suffered most from Andrew Jackson's vision of America. Jackson, both as a military leader and as president, pursued a policy of removing Indian tribes from their ancestral lands. This relocation would make room for settlers and often for speculators who made large profits from the purchase of sales of land. According to legend, a Cherokee rose, the state flower of Georgia, grew in every spot a tear fell on the Trail of Tears. Today the flowers grow along many of the trails that the Native Americans took west. Indian policy caused the president little political trouble because his primary supporters were from the southern and western states and generally favored a plan to remove all the Indian tribes to lands west of the Mississippi River. While Jackson and other politicians put a very positive and favorable spin on Indian removal in their speeches, the removals were in fact often very brutal. There was little that the Indians could do to defend themselves. In 1832, a group of about 1,000 Sac and Fox Indians led by Chief Black Hawk returned to Illinois, but militia members easily drove them back across the Mississippi. The Seminole resistance in Florida was more formidable, resulting in the war that began under Chief Okasawa and lasted into the 1840s. The Cherokees of Georgia, on the other hand, used legal action to resist. The Cherokee people were by no means frontier savages. By the 1830s, they developed their own written language, printed newspapers, and elected leaders to representative government. When the government of Georgia refused to recognize their freedom and threatened to seize their lands, the Cherokees took their case to the U.S. Supreme Court and won a favorable decision. John Marshall's opinion for the court majority of Cherokee Nation v. Georgia was essentially that Georgia had no jurisdiction over the Cherokees and no claims to their lands. But Georgia officials simply ignored the decision, and President Jackson refused to enforce it. Jackson was furious and personally affronted by the Marshall's ruling, stating, "Mr. Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Finally, federal troops came to Georgia to remove the tribes forcibly. As early as 1831, the army began to push the Chouas off their lands to march to Oklahoma. In 1835, some Cherokee leaders agreed to accept western lands and payment in exchange for relocation. With this agreement, the Treaty of New Chouas, Jackson had the green light to order Cherokee removal. Other Cherokees under the leadership of Chief John Ross resisted until the bitter end. About 20,000 Cherokees were marched westward at gunpoint on the infamous Trail of Tears. Nearly a quarter perished on the way, with the remainder left to seek survival in a completely foreign land. The tribe became hopelessly divided as the followers of Ross murdered those who signed the Treaty of New Chouas. The Trail of Tears is the most sorrowful legacy of the Jacksonian era. The life of David and Delilah Mcnair were destroyed by the Indian removal policy due to the fact that Delilah was half Cherokee.
About he was the wealthiest Cherokee in the Cherokee Nation, but his family was not exempt from the Trail of Tears either. Back then, it didn't matter if you were mixed blood or full blood Cherokee. If the government knew you had any degree of Indian blood whatsoever, you were forced out. So, say your grandma's a Cherokee and you're only an eighth, you had to go just like a full blood family would have to go. So the Vans, their wealth really made no difference. The fact that they were partially Cherokee meant that they had to go. So Delilah Van, she had married a white man named David Mcnair, and they lived just up the road from us. They lived right across the Tennessee state line, or what is now the Tennessee state line. Of course, back then it was all the Cherokee Nation. But David Mcnair, her husband, had passed away before the removal. He died in 1836. So she could have left when Jovan, her brother, did. They were pretty wealthy as well, and she could have booked passage aboard a steamship the way her brother did, but she wanted to make sure that her husband's grave was taken care of. And so she was getting, she had a pretty elaborate stone for his grave, and it was being carved down near Tate, Georgia, out of marble. And so she wanted to make sure that her husband's final resting place was taken care of. So she got caught up in the mass hysteria of the very end of the Trail of Tears in 38 and 39. And so she was rounded up and put in a containment facility in Charleston, Tennessee. And she caught cholera, which ran rampant in those camps. And so here, even this wealthy Cherokee mixed blood woman is still in those concentration camps, and she ends up dying. And her children say, "Look, my dad was a white military officer. Can't we at least take Mama's body to be buried with our father, who had just died 2 years prior?" And so because David Mcnair, her husband, was formerly a captain in the military, they did allow a military escort to escort her body back to the family plot there in Tennessee. So she ends up having one of the only marked graves on the Trail of Tears. So again, the reason why we use that story is, number one, it has something to do with the Van family, but also it shows how no one was exempt. Everybody, rich, poor, mixed blood, full blood. If you were Indian, you were an Indian, and you had to leave. So that was the brutality of it at the time.